of items in life in my northern town. This is podcast number 2. Today is September 17th. I'm sitting at a Renaissance festival because my husband throws Highland Games. That's the games where the men wear kilts. They throw the caber, or some people call it a telephone pole, as well as other heavy events, throwing them for distance and for height. Unfortunately, it's a torrential downpour today at the Renaissance Festival, and I'm sitting in the truck knitting and doing the podcast. I don't always dress up. I have in the past. This is the festival where everyone dresses up in Renaissance period clothing. The pickle man is selling his wares and, really insulting people as they go by to buy a pickle. They have the big turkey legs, jousting and all that. It happens, and it looks like it's happening today. The crowd is small, but as the rain thins out, there seems to be more and more people here. And overall, I think the festival will have a successful day, and the Highland Games will get underway shortly. I made a rookie mistake, though. I brought an umbrella, and I had my wrap, but I went to the low side of the festival. The hill is on the top at the high side, and half of the festival is on the low side. And I wanted to go see my favorite glassmaker. He sells from Dearborn Glass Company, Art Glass, and I like to go look at all of their work. It's on the low side. Oh, I stepped in a mud puddle, both ankles deep in water. The rain just kept coming down. I haven't seen flash flooding like this since I lived in the southwestern states. So overall, I went back to the car and I'm waiting for the weather to improve, for the ground to dry out. And then I'm going to go buy some lunch, sit under my umbrella, watch the Highland Games, maybe take a few pictures, and then share with you what's been going on in my creative journey this week. All right, so first of all, I wanted to say that I do some long arming for a few customers. I do work full-time in healthcare, and I made a humongous goof this week. I got a big queen-size quilt, and I do a lot of my quilting in the morning before I go to work. I measured the quilt, had it all set up, and the top was exactly the same size as the back for the width that would fit on my frame. It's actually 114 inches in spots, and my frame really is 110. So I called the lady who made the quilt, and she said I could take 1.5 inches off each side, which was fine because the final border was 6 or 8 inches wide, and her intention was to cut it down after the quilt was done so that her bed ruffle would show on her new queen-size bed. Now, if you haven't noticed, those new queen-size beds have an 11 to 12 inch drop on the sides of the mattress. So you really have to have a big quilt to make it fit and not just barely cover you up when you're sleeping under it. So I did all of the trimming down, and I got it all prepped and ready, and I put it on the frame, and I realized this is not a square quilt. It was rectangular, and quite honestly, the back was plenty big enough. I'm glad I cut it down 1.5 inches. It gave me more room, and I did a lot of what I call custom quilting. Not super dense, but each border had a different stitch. I started out with swirls, went with what I call candy ribbons on a tiny border, and then on the inside was a very large gray border, which I did with a feather and swirls, and then I went to more swirls on a solid border, and then in the flower stars I did a very light, modern, repeating, echoing flower in it. It turned out really well. So I really have a million threads to bury now because I have about a 12 or 14 inch space on each pass that I can quilt, and I did a lot of start and stops. I like to not bury and fray check my threads on the long arm. It takes more time, but I don't have a stitch locking feature on this machine, and I don't trust that it's gonna stay, so I do overkill. Hand quilting was where I started, and I bury the threads just like I do in a hand quilt. I am glad that the big quilt's done. So now I have 3 pillow shams for the same family. It's her daughter, who's probably in her 60s, and her mother, who's in her 80s, made this quilt together. And then I have a quilt of valor that I'm going to put on the frame. I do a couple of those a year, and I have a whole stack of other quilts to talk about that are both mine and customers. This week I spent a lot of time sewing. I did finish my Tula Pink 100, all 100 of the modern city sampler blocks. They're 6.5 inch, and I really like working with that size. So 100 of them will make another queen size quilt, and I keep telling myself I'm not going to make another queen size quilt, but I keep making them. Who am I kidding? I like making those quilts. Negative space. I'm not really sure how I'm going to set this one. She has a few ideas in the back of her book, and some of them they'll use 1.5 inch wide strips to make the sashing. Really long 1.5 inch wide strips are not my friends. They wibble and wobble, and they're very noticeable, so I may opt to go with just a bold color solid fabric and set them in a 10 by 10 setting, and that will give me a queen size quilt. I am knitting on a sock yarn, and that is making a cowl. I joined a Yarn of the Month club through a local quilt shop in actually a city that's about 70 miles from my house, because we don't have a local yarn and quilt shop. And I have 11 of the 12 months, and I've made about 4 of the knitted projects. I have to tell you, I am the slowest knitter in the universe, but I do like doing simple knits. I can do more difficult ones, but when I have time to knit, it's after work or in the evening while a football game is on, or when I'm traveling in a car or something, and I need something that is not super complicated. Besides, I don't like making 3-dimensional knits. I don't particularly like sewing a lot of garments, and so I stick with squares or strips or cowls, things that are simple. I've made sampler knitted blankets before, and they turned out great. So I like doing patterns over and over. There's a theme with this, isn't there? Because I've also do a lot of Zentangle, and I've tried new patterns this week. I'll put all of those up on my blog, which you can find at www.mycreativecorner3.wordpress.com. The 3 is a number, mycreativecorner3.wordpress.com. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about classes. I don't take very many classes. In fact, I've only taken probably 3 classes in the 30, 40 years that I've really been quilting. I've had a lot of friends show me different techniques at their house, so I don't count those. But formal classes where I signed up, I paid money, I took my supplies, I did the homework. Last week I showed one of those, which was a sampler quilt, and that was the first class I ever took after my friend Sue showed me how to do some quilting. It was the traditional hand piece, hand quilt, cut your templates out, go home and do the block, and it took 12 weeks. It's a 12 block sampler. Each block is 12.5 inches, and you sashed it, and then you hand quilted it all on your own time once the class was done. I still think that teaching in that way of adding skills, not with templates, but adding skills, like starting with strips and squares, and then to half square triangles, and we did 1 applique block. I still think it's a good idea. In fact, I'm trying to get some classes going where I'm teaching at my local quilt shop, and I have 2 classes for November, and I'm thinking about doing 2 blocks each class, and then take a couple months off, and then after the holidays do 2 more classes in a month, and each class will be about 2 hours. So that's what I was thinking, but I thought I'd ask podcasters and those who are listening and teachers who have done classes before, beginner classes, is that too ambitious to do a sampler with 2 simple blocks each class? I'm thinking of starting with a 9 patch and a triple rail fence the first week. And then the second one, doing half square triangles and doing a 8-pointed star is the hardest one. And adding a log cabin is the second one, because we'll continue to expand on strips and assembling. My goal is to teach beginning students the 1/4-inch seam allowance and how to read a pattern. I really thought that was the biggest takeaway from the first class I ever took. That teacher did a really good job on showing you how to read a pattern, but then she also would write things out step by step, Eleanor Burns style. And I bought many of those books over the years as I was learning how to do half square triangles in different methods, how to use a rotary cutter, and how to put things together. But that very first class with hand sewing, it made me slow down and really look at the process. I'm not going to make it required that people hand sew, nor make it required that they bring a sewing machine. I think that it's possible that there are many people who still like to hand sew. It's not my strength due to a lot of arthritis in my hands over the years. I've done a lot of abuse to those hands with my projects, but that's my plan. So any feedback on that would be welcome, because I've never taught a class before. Every time I go to do a class, there just doesn't seem to be people who are interested at the times I can teach them, nor has there been a big promotion with the quilt shop. I have a simple pattern that I had published several years ago that I wanted to really promote for modern quilting and have that be a class. It's a rectangle block with strips and squares. And I thought that would be a great quilt after a first 2 to 4 beginner classes to take all the knowledge and make that kind of a class number 5 on having a full quilt pattern that's totally different from the sampler. The 4 classes that I was thinking about doing would have 2 blocks each. That would be 8 blocks, and then give them some options on how to assemble them and make additional blocks that you could change up using colors or something like that. Anyway, I have a Electric Quilter 6, and I was going to draft up some ideas in that. And before I got going, I thought I'd get some feedback from everybody. So please leave a comment on my blog or Podbean. Looks like they have a way of doing some comments on there too. And let me know from your experience taking a class what is good, what is bad. If you're a beginner quilter, what you would look for in a teacher. So overall, that's what I've been doing in the quilting world. And I do a lot of other things too. Highland Games is wrapping up for the season. We usually start in May for Memorial Day weekend, as that's traditionally the kickoff to the summer here in the United States and in Michigan. The weather usually warms up enough. And Labor Day, which is in September, is traditionally the end of summer. We are starting to get cold weather already. 40 degrees at night is typical in September. And frost and all of the cold business will start up within the next 6 to 8 weeks. We have autumnal colors that are starting to really come on, and it will probably peak within 3 to 4 weeks. So we do a lot of taking back country roads and looking at the beautiful changing of the leaves to the bright oranges, reds, and yellows. Currently, just the very tips of the trees are changing, and peak season won't be for a little bit. If you don't live in an area of the world that has those kinds of changes, I will post over the next few weeks on my blog both recent and old pictures that I have taken of this one time of the year where nature's beauty is so abundant, and you don't have to be a great photographer to catch a beautiful moment. If you have the opportunity to travel somewhere and see those types of autumnal colors, it's worth the trip. Just the unfortunate thing is you got to just kind of watch the weather, watch the forecasters when they're telling you peak season is coming, because what happens in Michigan is that the snow will get an early snow coming and right about peak season, and the Thursday before the best weekend of viewing ever, we get a terrible sloppy slushy snow that knocks all the leaves down. And that's what's happened the last couple of years, and I don't have a lot of peak season pictures because of rain or sloppy snow. I wanted to talk about when you're done with a big project. Sometimes I need to do some smaller projects or more lighthearted projects before I dive into a new one. And I think what I'm going to work on is actually some Christmas present types of small projects, and then work on some sample things. I bought a quick curve ruler last year, and I want to try some projects with piecing on that, as well as working on loading some quilts that I can experiment with some stitches on. I think back on, that first class I took and how everything was an experiment of color and picking fabric and doing all kinds of design and stitching. And I really found that to be the most appealing part of quilting to me, that I can play with all of these colors and make something at the end that is actually a very long-term project that turns out to be beautiful, even when it doesn't quite meet my mind's eye's view of what's going to happen. I'm to a point that I do a big project, and usually they're my own design, but this Tulip Pink one I bought impulsively at a book rack in, I think, Pink Castle Fabrics in Ann Arbor, online store, modern fabrics that are wonderful. And I thought, I have a whole bunch of these great things that I can play in color. And that's exactly what the book did. It allowed me to play with colors. It allowed me to play with small pieces that were not paper piece, because I lean on paper piecing a lot for tiny, tiny blocks. I had thought at one time I wanted to do a Dear Jane, and I've kind of graduated from that thought because they're very small. It's applique, which I hate doing, and it's more traditional, but you could really modernize Dear Janes. But it's the applique that was the big turnoff. So I think that's what's continued my enjoyment of quilting, and the other part is it's a very long process. And as I've gotten older, I like doing instant gratification projects, but I also really like the intense, long-term commitment to starting a project, taking all these random pieces that I think might go together, really working on getting a design planned, and then just executing it to the best level I can at the time. I have a middle ear problem, and that causes me to have some terrible balance. And, some days my eye and hand coordination aren't great. And so I do the best I can. When I have a flare-up, which isn't as often as it used to be, things aren't super great. I probably stick with knitting on those days and don't run heavy machinery like a long-arm quilter. But overall, the quilting process has been great. And that's why I really enjoyed this Tulip Pink sampler pattern. You don't have to do all 100 blocks to achieve a beautiful quilt. She has several ideas that are smaller numbers of blocks. And in fact, if I didn't want to make a queen, I could break them up into other groups of colors and make twins or full sizes. But I still think I'm going to put them all together in one big one. Well, that brings up another touchy subject, doesn't it? It's called the cost of buying backing fabric, large pieces of yardage for sashing and batting. Honestly, that's probably why I work more with long arming after my day job, because it helps me to be able to purchase those items when I probably couldn't otherwise afford, 10 yards of fabric at $12 a yard, or 10, or even with a coupon with some larger store. But I will always find a way to get those pieces of fabric And in fact, I've had some quilts languish during lean times, in a bin until I had enough money to put them together. But I'll have to say, ever since that story where I put the pinwheel quilt together and threw it in the trash and then pulled it out, I decided then and there that every quilt that I start deserves to finish because I invested a lot of time, money, blood, sweat, tears, the whole business. I do some pattern testing for Quiltmaker 100 block also, and I put those blocks together periodically for gifts and samplers or random things. I made little books for my grandchildren that use these large blocks that were kind of like find-its. And I think there's lots of things you can do with orphan blocks. Well, that about wraps up everything that I wanted to talk about this week. And if you want to improve your skills for stitching small pieces and playing with a riot of color, basically lots of color, I thought the Tula Pink City Sampler was fun to do. And those blocks are small and easy to assemble once you get how to read the patterns in her book. And they're almost instant gratification. There's a really large group of people on Instagram right now doing one block a day. And in 100 days, you really could have them all done. I wound up starting mine a year ago. And then I had to take some time off of quilting over the holidays. And then I had some other deadlined quilts. And then I picked it back up this summer and finished it. So give it a look. I thought it was worth trying and using it as a way to experiment with color and design. Well, I'm sitting here at the Highland Games still at the Michigan Renaissance Festival, and I have to say the rain has almost stopped. The ground is still wet, but I don't see standing pools of water in the parking lot. I hear some bagpipes and drums in the background. And I think there are more people filling in. I'm going to go see if they started the caber toss yet. Try to grab a few pictures. If I can't because of the rain, I have pictures from a couple weeks ago when we were here and some from last year. This Highland Game business is so much fun. It is like a track meet. When you think about it, there are usually 6 to 8 events a game. A competition, they call it. And there are as many athletes as there are available slots for each venue. This one happens to be a smaller venue because the field is small and they have a very large crowd. But some games have, 30 athletes and larger place to do all of the events. And I have to say, if you've never tried it, it's worth watching. They have women's groups, young men's group, old men's groups, and novice groups, just depending on the different events that you can go to in your area. I happen to have Celtic Heritage, and I find it a great way to do a lot of research on the history of the sport, to keep in touch with my ancestral roots, and kind of verifying a lot of the stories that my grandmothers told me about our ancestors. So I look at it from a historical perspective, but it is great entertainment if you can go to one that has a large festival attached to it. Because usually there's Highland dancing, Irish dancing, all kinds of music, food, maybe a little adult beverages in the pub. And in fact, I think that's where I'm going to head out toward now. See if there's any turkey legs still available, and check out their beverage selection. Thank you for listening. Check out my blog at My Creative Corner 3 at wordpress.com. Leave a comment because I really want to get some ideas about teaching a class. What's good? What's bad? Am I being too ambitious? And just let me know what's going on in your part of the world. Thanks for listening.